The autumn mist clung to the Kanawha Valley like a shroud, wrapping around the Eldridge mansion with an almost deliberate malice. Built in 1823, the colonial structure had once been a symbol of prosperity, but by 1870, ivy had claimed its brick walls, and the windows stared out like hollow eyes into the West Virginia wilderness. The nearest neighbor lived 7 miles away, and the closest town, Cedar Falls, might as well have been on another continent for all the contact the Eldridge family maintained with the outside world. Reverend Asahel Eldridge stood at his study window, watching his youngest son, Matthias, chop wood in the courtyard below. The boy was 16, lean and pale from the family's frequent fasting rituals, his movements mechanical and precise. Asahel's weathered hands pressed against the cold glass as he remembered the fever that had nearly claimed his life 3 years prior. For 7 days and nights, he had burned with a temperature that should have killed him, and in those delirious hours, he claimed to have received visions that would reshape his understanding of divine will. The fever had broken on the 8th day, leaving him forever changed. Where once he had preached conventional Protestant doctrine to his family, now he spoke of deeper truths, of flesh that must be mortified to achieve spiritual purity. His wife, Constance, had initially resisted these new teachings, but her protests had grown weaker over time, especially after their eldest daughter, Mercy, had begun experiencing what Asahel called divine ecstasies during their evening prayer sessions. The mansion housed 3 generations of Eldridges, Asahel and Constance, their 4 children ranging from 16 to 28, and 6 grandchildren, the oldest being 14. What had begun as an isolated religious family had evolved into something far more insidious under Asahel's increasingly radical interpretation of Scripture. In the basement of the mansion, behind a false wall that Asahel had constructed himself, lay a chamber he called the Sanctum of Purification. The room was lit by candles arranged in precise geometric patterns, and the walls were covered with his handwritten interpretations of biblical passages, twisted into justifications for practices that would have horrified any legitimate theologian. Iron braziers stood ready to heat the metal implements he used for what he termed sacred marking, and wooden crosses of various sizes leaned against the stone walls. As evening approached, Asahel rang the brass bell that summoned his family to what they called true worship. One by one, they filed into the main parlor, his wife Constance, her once bright eyes now dulled by years of psychological manipulation, his eldest son Jeremiah, 28, and already showing signs of the mental instability that ran through their bloodline, his daughter Mercy, 25, whose nervous tics had developed after years of her father's spiritual guidance, his son Ezekiel, 22, who had learned to mimic his father's fervor to avoid punishment, and young Matthias, who still possessed enough innocence to occasionally question what he witnessed. "Tonight," Asahel announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who believed himself divinely chosen, "we begin the preparation of young Sarah for her covenant of flesh." Sarah, Jeremiah's 14-year-old daughter, stood trembling beside her father, her dark hair braided in the severe style mandated for all females in the household. She had been born and raised within the confines of the estate, knowing no world beyond her grandfather's twisted teachings. The covenant of flesh was Asahel's term for a ritual he had developed, claiming it was revealed to him during his fever visions. It involved the systematic breaking down of a young person's physical and psychological boundaries through a series of increasingly invasive ceremonies, all justified as necessary for spiritual purification. The process typically began when a child reached 14 and culminated in what Asahel called sacred union, marriages between family members that he claimed restored the original purity of Adam and Eve. As the family gathered in a circle, Asahel opened his personal Bible, its pages filled with his own annotations and additions. The original text had been so heavily modified that it bore little resemblance to any recognized version of Scripture. He began to read from what he called the Book of Flesh, passages he claimed had been hidden from mainstream Christianity, but revealed to him through divine vision. The body is the temple, he intoned, but a temple corrupted by the world's touch. Only through the breaking of earthly shame can the spirit ascend to its rightful place beside the Creator. Tonight, we begin Sarah's journey from corruption to purity, from the flesh of the world to the flesh of the spirit. The wind outside picked up, rattling the mansion's windows and causing the candles to flicker ominously. In the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing across the valley like a warning that went unheeded. The Eldridge family's descent into darkness was about to claim another victim, and the isolated mansion would once again become a chamber of horrors disguised as a house of worship. As Asahel led his family toward the basement stairs, Sarah's quiet sobs were the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. The sanctum of purification awaited, and with it, the continuation of practices that had already claimed the sanity and innocence of too many young Eldridges. The Reverend's vision was becoming reality, one broken soul at a time. The basement chamber reeked of melted wax and something else, a metallic scent that seemed to permeate the very stones. Sarah's bare feet touched the cold floor as her family formed a circle around her, their faces illuminated by the dancing candlelight. The walls bore witness to years of Asahel's divine work, stained with substances that spoke of rituals no Christian church would recognize. Asahel had spent months preparing Sarah for this moment, gradually introducing her to the concepts that would justify what was to come. He called it theological conditioning, a process of slowly warping a young mind's understanding of right and wrong until the victim became complicit in their own abuse. Sarah had been taught that her body was inherently sinful, that only through her grandfather's guidance could she achieve the purity necessary for salvation. "Remove the garments of worldly shame," Asahel commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. This was always the first step, the systematic removal of normal human modesty under the guise of spiritual openness. Sarah's hands trembled as she obeyed, having been conditioned to believe that resistance would damn her soul for eternity. Constance watched from the shadows, her face a mask of resigned horror. She had once tried to protect her grandchildren from her husband's increasingly disturbing practices, but years of psychological manipulation had worn down her resistance. Asahel had convinced her that her maternal instincts were actually demonic influences trying to prevent their family's spiritual elevation. Now she stood silent, complicit in the destruction of another innocent life. The doctrine of sacred flesh, as Asahel had written it in his modified Bible, taught that the human body must be reclaimed from worldly corruption through a series of ritualistic violations. He claimed that conventional morality was a trap set by Satan to prevent true believers from achieving divine union. In his twisted theology, acts that society deemed abhorrent were actually sacred ceremonies that brought the participant closer to God. Jeremiah stepped forward, carrying one of the heated iron implements from the brazier. His own initiation into his father's cult had occurred 15 years earlier, and the psychological damage was evident in his hollow stare and mechanical movements. He had learned to suppress his natural revulsion, replacing it with the fervent belief that he was performing holy work. The brand in his hand bore a symbol that Asahel claimed had been revealed to him in his fever dreams, a twisted cross intertwined with serpentine forms. The first mark of purification, Asahel announced, removes the stain of original birth. Through sacred pain, the flesh is made ready for divine inhabitation. The brand pressed against Sarah's shoulder, and her scream echoed through the chamber, a sound that had become all too familiar within the mansion's walls. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the incense that Asahel burned during these ceremonies, creating an olfactory memory that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But the physical marking was only the beginning. Asahel's true innovation lay in his psychological manipulation, his ability to convince his victims that their suffering was not only necessary, but sacred. He had developed an elaborate system of rewards and punishments that gradually broke down a person's sense of self, replacing it with complete dependence on his approval and interpretation of divine will. As Sarah collapsed to the floor, her grandfather knelt beside her, his voice taking on the gentle tone he used when cementing his psychological control. "The pain you feel is the old flesh dying," he whispered, stroking her hair with false tenderness. "Soon, you will understand the joy that comes from complete surrender to God's will. Your body is no longer your own. It belongs to the divine purpose I have been chosen to fulfill." The other family members watched in silence, each lost in their own memories of similar initiations. Mercy unconsciously touched the scars on her own arms, remembering the night her father had first introduced her to the sacred union that would bind her to her brother Ezekiel in what Asahel called a marriage of spiritual purity. The ceremony had taken place 3 years earlier, when Mercy was 22 and Ezekiel 19, and had resulted in the birth of 2 children who now lived under the same twisted doctrine that had created them. Young Matthias stood at the edge of the circle, his 16-year-old mind struggling to process what he witnessed. Unlike his older siblings, he retained enough connection to normal human emotion to feel revulsion at his family's practices. But Asahel had already begun his conditioning, teaching him that these feelings were evidence of his spiritual immaturity. Soon, Matthias would face his own initiation, and his grandfather was confident that he would eventually embrace the family's sacred mission. The ritual continued for hours, each stage designed to further break down Sarah's psychological defenses while reinforcing Asahel's absolute authority. By dawn, another young Eldridge had been inducted into the family's secret doctrine, her innocence sacrificed on the altar of her grandfather's delusions. The mansion's walls had absorbed another night of horror, and the cycle that had begun with Asahel's fever visions continued its relentless progression. As the family finally dispersed to their rooms, exhausted by the night's activities, none of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond the mansion's grounds. Thomas Whitmore, a traveling preacher who had lost his way in the valley's winding paths, had witnessed enough through the basement window to understand that something profoundly evil was taking place within the Eldridge home. His hands shook as he mounted his horse, knowing that he carried with him knowledge that would either save innocent lives or cost him his own. 3 months had passed since Sarah's initiation, and the autumn of 1870 had given way to a brutal West Virginia winter. Snow lay thick around the Eldridge mansion, creating an even more complete isolation from the outside world. The family's food stores, carefully rationed according to Asahel's fasting requirements, were running low, but the Reverend claimed this scarcity was another divine test of their faith. Sarah had changed dramatically since her first night in the sanctum of purification. The bright, curious girl, who had once asked innocent questions about the world beyond their property, had been replaced by a hollow-eyed young woman who spoke only when spoken to and moved with the mechanical precision of someone whose spirit had been systematically broken. The scars on her body told the story of her ongoing purification, each mark representing another stage in her grandfather's twisted curriculum. Asahel had decided that Sarah was ready for the final phase of her spiritual education, the sacred union. According to his doctrine, this ceremony would complete her transformation from a corrupted worldly being into a vessel of divine purity. The chosen partner for this union was her own uncle Matthias, who had recently undergone his own initiation into the family's secret practices. The preparation for the sacred union involved weeks of what Asahel called spiritual conditioning. Sarah and Matthias were required to spend hours together in prayer and meditation, gradually becoming comfortable with physical contact that would have been unthinkable in normal society. Asahel justified these practices by claiming that conventional morality was a corruption of God's original design, that the shame associated with familial intimacy was actually Satan's way of preventing humans from achieving divine unity. Constance had long since stopped questioning her husband's interpretations of Scripture, but the approaching ceremony filled her with a dread she could no longer suppress. She had watched her own children and grandchildren disappear into the psychological maze that Asahel had constructed, and she knew that Sarah's sacred union would mark another point of no return. Yet her attempts to intervene had been met with such violent retribution that she had learned to suffer in silence. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the family's corruption. Rooms that had once been filled with normal family life had been converted to serve Asahel's rituals. The dining room now housed an altar constructed from blackened wood, carved with symbols that the Reverend claimed had been revealed to him in his visions. The library had been cleared of all books except Asahel's modified Bible and his personal journals, which contained detailed records of each family member's spiritual progress. On the night of the sacred union, the family gathered once again in the basement chamber. The walls had been decorated with fresh candles and arrangements of winter branches that Asahel claimed possessed sacred properties. Sarah and Matthias stood at the center of the circle, both dressed in white robes that would soon be discarded as part of the ceremony. Asahel began the ritual by reading from his personal scriptures, passages that bore no resemblance to any legitimate religious text. His voice carried the authority of absolute conviction as he described the divine mandate that required this union, the spiritual necessity that transcended earthly law and morality. To the family members who had been conditioned by years of psychological manipulation, his words carried the weight of divine truth. "Tonight," Asahel proclaimed, "we witness the restoration of Eden's purity. Before the corruption of worldly law, before the shame imposed by false prophets, humanity knew the sacred truth of flesh united in divine purpose. Sarah and Matthias will demonstrate this truth, becoming vessels through which God's original design is made manifest." The ceremony that followed was a grotesque parody of a wedding, combining religious symbolism with acts that violated every principle of human decency. Asahel had convinced his family that they were participating in a sacred mystery, that their actions were not only justified but required by divine command. The psychological conditioning that had preceded this moment ensured that even the victims believed themselves to be willing participants in their own degradation. As the ritual progressed, Jeremiah documented everything in a leather-bound journal, following his father's instructions to maintain detailed records of the family's spiritual practices. These journals would later serve as evidence of the systematic abuse that had taken place within the mansion's walls, but for now they were simply another tool in Asahel's campaign to normalize the abnormal. The other children watched from the shadows, their young minds absorbing lessons that would shape their understanding of love, family, and faith for the rest of their lives. Asahel had created a closed system where normal human emotions were reinterpreted as spiritual experiences, where violation was transformed into sacrament, and where the victims became complicit in perpetuating the cycle of abuse. By morning, another sacred union had been completed, and the Eldridge family's descent into darkness had reached a new depth. Sarah and Matthias, now bound together by their grandfather's twisted ceremony, would be expected to produce children who would continue the family's sacred lineage. The mansion had witnessed another night of horror, disguised as holiness, and the snow outside seemed to muffle even the memory of innocence. But unknown to the family, their isolation was about to be broken. Thomas Whitmore, the traveling preacher who had witnessed their earlier ritual, had spent months gathering evidence, and building the courage to act. His report to the authorities in Charleston would soon set in motion events that would expose the Eldridge family's secrets to the harsh light of justice. The walls that had protected their depravity for so long were about to come crashing down. Thomas Whitmore had not slept peacefully since that October night when he had stumbled upon the Eldridge property. The images burned into his memory: the candlelit basement, the screaming girl, the family's ritualistic participation in unspeakable acts, haunted his dreams and consumed his waking hours. As a man of God, he felt compelled to act, but as a human being, he feared the consequences of confronting such organized evil. For weeks, Thomas had wrestled with his conscience in his small parsonage in Charleston. He had served as a traveling minister for 15 years, bringing the gospel to isolated communities throughout West Virginia, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he had witnessed at the Eldridge mansion. The systematic nature of the abuse, the religious justifications, the complete psychological control. It was evil wearing the mask of righteousness. The winter of 1870 was particularly harsh, and Thomas used the weather as an excuse to delay his report to the authorities. But as February arrived and the snow began to melt, he could no longer postpone his duty. He had gathered what evidence he could: sketches of the mansion's layout, detailed notes about what he had observed, and testimony from a few brave souls in Cedar Falls who had whispered stories about the strange Eldridge family. Sheriff William Crawford was a practical man who had seen his share of frontier violence, but Thomas's report left him visibly shaken. The preacher's credibility was unquestioned. He was known throughout the region as a man of integrity and sound judgment. If Thomas Whitmore claimed to have witnessed ritualistic abuse at the Eldridge property, then Crawford had no choice but to investigate. "You understand what you're asking me to do," Crawford said, leaning back in his chair as he studied the preacher's notes. "The Eldridges have lived in that valley for 50 years. Asahel Eldridge is a respected minister, at least among those who know him. If we're wrong about this..." "We're not wrong," Thomas replied firmly. "I saw what I saw. That girl's screams will haunt me until the day I die. Whatever's happening in that house, it's an abomination before God and man." Crawford assembled a small posse of trusted deputies, men who could be counted on to maintain discretion if the investigation proved fruitless. They would approach the Eldridge property under the pretense of a routine welfare check, citing reports of illness in the family. It was a thin excuse, but it would have to suffice. Meanwhile, at the Eldridge mansion, Asahel was experiencing what he interpreted as divine warnings about approaching danger. His paranoia, always present beneath his religious fervor, had intensified in recent weeks. He had begun conducting additional purification rituals, claiming that the family needed extra spiritual protection against the forces of darkness that sought to destroy their sacred work. The mansion's atmosphere had grown even more oppressive as winter deepened. The family's isolation was complete now. No contact with the outside world, no relief from Asahel's constant surveillance and control. The children moved through the house like ghosts, their personalities so thoroughly suppressed that they seemed barely human. Even Constance had retreated into a kind of living death, her mind unable to process the reality of what her family had become. Sarah's condition had deteriorated significantly since her sacred union with Matthias. The psychological trauma of the ceremony, combined with the ongoing physical abuse disguised as spiritual discipline, had left her in a state of near catatonia. She spent most of her days sitting by the window in her room, staring out at the snow-covered valley with empty eyes. When she did speak, it was only to repeat the religious phrases that Asahel had drilled into her consciousness. Matthias, too, showed signs of severe psychological damage. The 16-year-old boy, who had once questioned his grandfather's teachings, had been replaced by a hollow shell who mechanically performed whatever rituals were demanded of him. The sacred union had completed his psychological destruction, transforming him from victim to perpetrator in the family's cycle of abuse. On the morning of February 15th, 1871, Sheriff Crawford and his deputies began their journey to the Eldridge property. The roads were treacherous with melting snow and mud, and the 7-mile ride took most of the morning. As they approached the valley, an unnatural silence seemed to settle over the landscape. Even the birds appeared to avoid the area around the mansion. The house itself looked like something from a Gothic nightmare. The ivy that covered its walls had died during the winter, leaving skeletal brown tendrils clinging to the brick like grasping fingers. Several windows were boarded up, and those that remained uncovered stared out like dead eyes. Smoke rose from only one chimney, suggesting that the family was conserving fuel or that their numbers had somehow diminished. Crawford dismounted and approached the front door, his hand resting on his pistol. The other deputies spread out around the property, taking positions that would prevent anyone from escaping if the situation turned violent. The sheriff's knock echoed through the mansion like a gunshot, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. When the door finally opened, Crawford found himself face to face with Jeremiah Eldridge. The man's appearance was shocking. Gaunt to the point of starvation, with wild eyes and nervous tics that spoke of severe psychological disturbance. His clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, and he emanated an odor of unwashed bodies and something else, something that reminded Crawford of a slaughterhouse. "Sheriff Crawford," Jeremiah said, his voice barely above a whisper, We weren't expecting visitors." "Routine welfare check," Crawford replied, studying the man's face for signs of deception. "We've had reports of illness in your family. Mind if we come in and make sure everyone's all right?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Behind Jeremiah, Crawford could see movement in the shadows of the mansion's interior. Other family members gathering to observe this unprecedented intrusion into their isolated world. The moment of truth had arrived, and the secrets that the Eldridge family had hidden for so long were about to be exposed to the light of justice. Sheriff Crawford's entry into the Eldridge mansion was like stepping into a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, melted wax, and something else, a metallic, organic odor that made his stomach turn. The interior of the house, once grand, had been transformed into something that resembled a medieval monastery designed by a madman. Religious symbols covered every available surface, but they were wrong somehow, twisted versions of Christian iconography that seemed to mock rather than celebrate faith. Crosses hung upside down or were intertwined with serpentine forms, and biblical verses had been painted on the walls in what appeared to be dried blood. The furniture had been arranged to create altar-like spaces throughout the house, each one surrounded by melted candle stubs and stained with substances Crawford preferred not to identify. As the sheriff and his deputies moved through the mansion, they encountered the Eldridge family members one by one. Each person they met showed signs of severe psychological and physical trauma. Constance Eldridge, once presumably a normal wife and mother, cowered in corners and spoke only in religious phrases that made no coherent sense. The children moved with the mechanical precision of broken dolls, their eyes empty of any spark of normal human emotion. "Where is Reverend Eldridge?" Crawford asked Jeremiah, who had been following the lawman through the house like a nervous shadow. "Father is preparing for evening prayers," Jeremiah replied, his voice carrying an odd mixture of fear and reverence. "He doesn't like to be disturbed during his spiritual preparations." Crawford exchanged glances with his deputies. Deputy Marshal James Hendricks, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen his share of horrors, looked visibly shaken by what they were discovering. The systematic nature of the abuse was becoming clear. This wasn't the work of a single madman, but an entire family that had been corrupted by years of psychological manipulation. They found Sarah in what had once been a bedroom, but now resembled a monastic cell, The 14-year-old girl sat motionless on a bare mattress, her body covered in scars that formed deliberate patterns. When Crawford spoke to her, she didn't respond, except to recite biblical verses that had been so twisted from their original meaning that they sounded like incantations from some dark religion. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Deputy Hendricks, crossing himself as he took in the girl's condition. What kind of monsters could do this to a child? The answer came when they finally located Asahel Eldridge in the basement chamber that served as his sanctum of purification. The Reverend was kneeling before his makeshift altar, surrounded by the implements of his twisted rituals. When he turned to face the intruders, his eyes held the fanatic gleam of a man who had long since lost any connection to reality. "You dare to interrupt the sacred work?" Asahel demanded, rising to his full height. Despite his gaunt appearance, he radiated an aura of absolute authority that had cowed his family for years. "This is holy ground, consecrated by divine vision and sanctified by the blood of the faithful." Crawford had dealt with religious fanatics before, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer conviction in Asahel's voice. The man genuinely believed that his actions were not only justified, but mandated by God himself. The basement chamber told the story of years of systematic abuse, bloodstains on the stone floor, iron implements designed for torture, and walls covered with religious writings that bore no resemblance to any legitimate Christian doctrine. "Asahel Eldridge," Crawford said, his voice steady despite the horror surrounding him. "You're under arrest for crimes against nature and the corruption of minors. Your family members will be taken into protective custody, pending a full investigation." Asahel's response was a laugh that chilled the blood of every man present. "You cannot arrest a prophet of the Lord," he declared. "I have been chosen to restore the original purity of God's design, to undo the corruption that has poisoned humanity since the fall of Eden. These children are not victims, they are the blessed recipients of divine truth." The confrontation that followed would be remembered by the deputies for the rest of their lives. Asahel fought like a man possessed, screaming religious justifications for his actions, even as Crawford's men subdued him. His family watched in silence, their faces showing no emotion as their patriarch was dragged away in chains. Years of psychological conditioning had left them unable to process the reality of their liberation. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the Eldridge family's depravity. Jeremiah's journals, discovered hidden throughout the mansion, documented years of systematic abuse disguised as religious ritual. The sacred unions between family members, the ritualistic scarring of children, the psychological manipulation that had turned victims into accomplices. It was all recorded in meticulous detail. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the few female physicians in West Virginia, was brought in to examine the family members. Her report, filed with the state authorities, described injuries and psychological trauma that would take years to heal, if healing was even possible. Several of the children showed signs of severe malnutrition, and all of them exhibited the kind of psychological damage typically associated with prisoners of war. The trial of Asahel Eldridge became a sensation throughout the region. Newspapers from as far away as Richmond and Philadelphia sent reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to hear the details of the case. The Reverend's defense was simple. He claimed divine mandate for all his actions and insisted that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Whitman, painted a different picture. Using the evidence gathered from the mansion and the testimony of family members who had begun to recover their ability to speak, Whitman demonstrated that Asahel had systematically destroyed the minds and bodies of his own children and grandchildren over a period of years. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Asahel Eldridge was sentenced to life imprisonment, though many in the community felt that death would have been more appropriate. As he was led away to serve his sentence in the state penitentiary, the Reverend continued to proclaim his divine mission, insisting that his persecution was proof of his righteousness. The Eldridge mansion stood empty after the trial, its windows boarded up and its doors sealed by court order. The surviving family members were placed in the care of various charitable institutions, though their recovery would be a long and uncertain process. The house itself became a symbol of the evil that could flourish in isolation, hidden from the eyes of civilized society. 5 years had passed since the trial of Asahel Eldridge, and the mansion in Kanawha Valley had become a monument to human depravity. The state had attempted to sell the property, but no buyer could be found. Local residents whispered that the house was cursed, that the evil that had taken place within its walls had somehow infected the very stones and timber. Thomas Whitmore, the traveling preacher whose courage had exposed the Eldridge family's crimes, had never fully recovered from his experience. The knowledge of what he had witnessed haunted his dreams and affected his ability to minister to his congregations. He had developed a nervous condition that left his hands shaking and his voice uncertain when he tried to preach about the goodness of God in a world where such evil could exist. The surviving Eldridge family members had been scattered across various institutions and foster homes throughout West Virginia and neighboring states. Their recovery had been slow and incomplete. Sarah, now 19, had spent 3 years in a sanitarium before being placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. She rarely spoke and showed little interest in the world around her, though her caretakers reported occasional moments of clarity when she seemed to remember fragments of her life before the abuse began. Matthias had fared somewhat better, perhaps because his ordeal had been shorter than that of his older siblings. At 21, he had learned to function in normal society, though he remained deeply scarred by his experiences. He had taken a new name and moved to Ohio, where he worked as a clerk in a general store. His employers knew nothing of his background, and he intended to keep it that way. Constance Eldridge had died in the state asylum 2 years after her husband's conviction. The doctors said her heart had simply stopped, but those who knew her believed she had finally succumbed to the weight of guilt and horror that had consumed her final years. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her family name too tainted for any proper memorial. Jeremiah had been the most damaged of all the survivors. His role as his father's primary accomplice had left him with psychological wounds that proved impossible to heal. He had spent the years since the trial in and out of various institutions, his mind unable to distinguish between the twisted religious doctrine he had been taught and the reality of his crimes. He died in 1875, found hanging in his cell at the state hospital, a victim of the same evil that had destroyed so many others. Asahel himself had become something of a celebrity in the state penitentiary. Other inmates gave him a wide berth, disturbed by his continued insistence that he had been doing God's work. He spent his days writing religious treatises that the prison chaplain refused to read, convinced that they contained blasphemies that would corrupt anyone who encountered them. The Reverend showed no signs of remorse or recognition that his actions had been wrong, maintaining until his death that he had been chosen for a divine mission. The mansion stood empty through the harsh winter of 1875, its broken windows allowing snow to drift into rooms where unspeakable acts had once taken place. Local children dared each other to approach the property, but none were brave enough to actually enter the building. Stories began to circulate about strange lights seen in the windows at night and sounds that carried across the valley on still evenings. It was on a cold February night in 1876 that the mansion finally met its end. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but there had been no electricity in the building for years. Some said it was lightning from a freak winter storm, while others whispered that the fire had started spontaneously, as if the house itself had finally decided to purge the evil from its walls. Sheriff Crawford, now graying and nearing retirement, watched the flames from a distance as the volunteer fire brigade from Cedar Falls made a half-hearted attempt to save the structure. The truth was that no one really wanted to preserve the building. The mansion had become a symbol of shame for the entire region, a reminder of how evil could flourish when good people chose to look the other way. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming not just the building but seeming to cleanse the very ground on which it stood. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but a blackened foundation and scattered stones. The basement chamber, where so much suffering had taken place, was filled with ash and debris, its stone walls cracked by the intense heat. In the years that followed, nature began to reclaim the site. Weeds and wildflowers grew up through the ruins, and young trees took root in what had once been the mansion's rooms. The valley itself seemed to breathe easier, as if a weight had been lifted from the land. Travelers passing through the area reported a sense of peace that had been absent during the Eldridge family's occupation. Thomas Whitmore lived for another 20 years, eventually finding some measure of peace in his later ministry. He never spoke publicly about his role in exposing the Eldridge crimes, but those close to him knew that he considered it the most important work of his life. On his deathbed in 1895, his final words were a prayer of gratitude that he had found the courage to act when action was needed. The story of the Eldridge family became a cautionary tale told throughout Appalachia, a reminder of how religious authority could be corrupted and how isolation could allow evil to flourish unchecked. Parents used it to warn their children about the dangers of blind obedience to charismatic leaders, and ministers referenced it in sermons about the importance of community oversight in religious matters. By the turn of the century, the ruins of the Eldridge mansion had been completely overgrown by forest. A new generation of residents in the Kanawha Valley knew the story only as a dark legend from their grandparents' time. The site itself was unmarked and largely forgotten, known only to local historians and the occasional curious visitor who had heard whispers of the horrors that had once taken place there. But on certain nights, when the wind blows just right through the valley, old-timers claim they can still hear echoes of the past, the sound of children crying, the crack of flames consuming evil, and the whispered prayers of those who survived to tell the tale. The Eldridge mansion was gone, but its legacy remained as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate triumph of justice over even the most carefully hidden evil. The valley had healed, but it had not forgotten. And perhaps that was as it should be, for only by remembering the darkness can we truly appreciate the light.